The deity of Mrigashira is Soma, which refers to the immortal nectar most coveted by gods and mortals. This nectar promises to bless an individual not only with never-ending health, but also all of the main pleasures of life, which include beauty and intelligence and all other forms of enjoyments. Likewise, Mrigashira nakshatra itself is one blessed with natural health, beauty, and intelligence. In classical and mystical schools of thought, all three of these qualities were actually one and the same, as health is kin to beauty, and beauty was seen as a sign of all other virtues. In modern times, we even see this in the phenomenon of the angel effect. In Ayurveda, Soma is a cool substance that is often contrasted against Agni, the hot substance. Soma and Agni are essentially the foundation of alchemy in the Vedic perspective, where one churns these two qualities through the process of sexual friction so as to produce the elixir of the gods. So, generally speaking, it is thought that men are fiery and active and that women are watery and passive. This is true, but only on a physical level. On an internal, psychic, and astral level, it is said that men are the ones that are watery and passive, the same way semen is watery, and that women are fiery and hungry, the same way the female reproductive organ is hot and consuming. Because polarity shifts to its opposite on the plane that is immediately adjacent. So for example, on the terrestrial plane, it is men that are yang and women that are yin, but on the astral, it is men that are yin and women that are yang. In Ayurvedic terms, Soma is not an external substance, a plant or a shrub. Instead, Soma is made by the reproductive fluids. Soma is closely linked to semen, but it is not exactly the same thing as semen, as it is an even subtler aspect of semen that makes use of semen as a vessel. And actually, in alchemical terms, according to such writers as Mrigashira, both men and women produce semen. It is this alchemical semen that, when preserved and not ejaculated through futile sexual congress, that leads to strong bones, strong and healthy nails, bright and milky eyes, clear and glowing skin, shiny hair, a natural attractive scent, strong jaws, a plump physique, and overall beauty. It is also the semen or soma that leads to a strong and healthy mind, which leads to intelligence. But this same soma or semen must be cooked, must be churned, must be prepared, because in its raw state it is not as useful. This is why, in order to bring about all these benefits of soma, it must be properly and intelligently combined in the fires of Agni. The alchemists have various metaphors to depict this process of sexual transmutation. This intelligent combination of water and fire, coolness and heat, which represents both Soma and Agni. Remember that, alchemically speaking, both men and women produce semen, or in this case, Soma. Soma is said to drip from the top of the head into the fiery pit of the loins in the bottom. Soma drips from the top and Agni rests in the loins. In order to perform alchemy, one must stir the semen in the hot cauldron of Agni, so that the steam generated and the final product generated can nourish the whole body. If there is Soma but there is no Agni, then there is no transmutation. If there is Agni but no Soma, the same thing. So what does Agni represent in this analogy? Agni represents the heat of sexual exchange and sexual desire. To perform alchemy, you must actively interact with the opposite sex through kind words, delicate caresses, and indeed sexual intercourse. But you must take care to not spill the soma downwards and outwards. In other words, you must not ejaculate or orgasm. You simply add that sexual heat, that friction, but without that final explosion in the end, which essentially is the tipping over of the cauldron. According to Ayurveda, part of the normal functioning of the reproductive fluids, semen or soma in this case, is to nourish the body. It is this reproductive fluid, when allowed to properly flow, that gives rise to strong nails, strong bones, glowing skin, glowing eyes, shiny hair, a plump physique, and again, general attractiveness. So to build our internal reservoirs of soma, we must learn how to control and tame our sexual desires, allowing just enough heat to light the fire of the cauldron, but not too much that we orgasm, because in alchemical terms, to orgasm is sinful, as we spill the vital juices that are meant to lead us to immortality. What creates eternal beauty, eternal intelligence, and eternal pleasure is learning how to generate and preserve Soma through non-ejaculation. So, we are seeing one very important element to Mrigashira here. It is learning how to stir just enough sexual desire to make use of it as a fire to cook Soma, but simultaneously practicing celibacy. So we see this back and forth motion with Mrigashira, trying to generate Soma, trying to cook Soma, but also trying to keep itself from spilling Soma. There is a timid relationship that Mrigashira has with sex. On the one hand, it is fascinated by it as it recognizes its spiritual value. But on the other hand, it is fearful of losing the main ingredient of its youth and vitality, which is semen. There is a fear of being used, a fear of being spent with this nakshatra. Hence its anxiety regarding sex and its desire to run away, yet it knows it still needs sex, as without it there would be no cauldron to cook the internal Soma. Soma is of course deeply coveted as all people desire greater health, beauty, and pleasure. And naturally there are various tales of the gods and asuras slighting one another, trying to possess this precious elixir all for themselves. Of course, the substance takes a passive role in this story, as it is pulled back and forth, to and fro, powerless against the more dominant forces projected upon it. Semen itself is a substance that many spirits feed on, which is why there are various psychic attacks that men in particular experience that inspire a lot of lust in them as a means of getting them to spill the sacred seed, the sacred Soma, as a means of feeding themselves. And this is especially the case in our very sexualized modern society, where occult forces antagonize men and then collect the semen that they spill, fortifying themselves and leaving men weak. Mrigashira men often feel deeply victimized by femininity and sexuality, as they may have a hard time controlling themselves around such things, and then they feel resentful when they feel used and spent. It's interesting as well when one considers the fact that many prominent conservative men have Mrigashira placements, as they are often against pornography and the overall sexualized nature of the culture, as it generally weakens and disempowers men who do not know how to control themselves or resist these temptations. But Mrigashira being related to Soma not only explains its connection to nourishing the body through sexual fluids, but indeed nourishing the body through actual food and diet and nutrition, which are important elements of this nakshatra. That is very concerned with consuming the right foods that eventually lead to the external plumpness, softness, and juiciness that is most coveted. At its best, this nakshatra avoids corrosive and harmful substances like drugs and alcohol and focuses on fresh foods and health foods. Semen is considered the final result of all that is ingested in the body, and the quality of semen, or Soma, is directly related to one's diet. So to build the highest quality inner Soma, one must consume the best quality foods. The juiciness of Mrigashira is contrasted with the dryness of Kritika nakshatra, as Mrigashira represents Soma, but Kritika represents Agni, and so Kritika natives tend towards a sharpness and dryness even in their appearance. One can contextualize the symbol of the deer here. The frantic deer running away from the starving, predatory hunters wishing to satiate themselves with the essence of this beautiful, precious thing. In an alchemical sense, the fire element, which is the quality of heat, wishes to quench itself with the cooling quality of the water elements. Mrigashira then, aware of its own juiciness that is properly cultivated, leaps away from predation anytime it is asserted upon it. There is a fear in Mrigashira nakshatra of being used and taken advantage of, having others be attracted to it merely for the purpose of quenching their thirst in the fountain of their Soma, and then abandoning them, leaving them dried out and spent, which would generally explain the anxiety regarding romantic connections. Soma is of course connected to other things like substances that offer an individual altered states of mind that one uses to gain tangible access to other realities for spiritual growth and expansion, which is why Mrigashira natives are naturally attracted to drugs and mushrooms and other such things. Now, it is said by alchemists that this ability to access altered states need not be assisted by external substances like drugs. Instead, one can learn how to self-generate these states if one understands how to properly conserve and utilize Soma. Soma is also said by some to be produced using various aphrodisiacs, and so is sexually energizing. Though Soma is represented as calm, peaceful, passive, and still. The symbolism of the deer is agitated, nervous, paranoid, and constantly in motion. And one finds that the temperament of Mrigashira natives is best represented by the anxious nature of the deer over the calm nature of Soma. In fact, Mrigashira natives are constantly attempting to calm their nerves and pacify their anxieties through the use of various lesser forms of Soma, like good food, fruit juice, and even alcohol and at worst drugs. Mrigashira natives are naturally nervous, but are looking to pacify their nervousness through acquiring greater forms of Soma, through consuming greater forms of Soma. Another deity associated with Mrigashira, according to various astrological sources, is goddess Parvati, a goddess with many stories of her weeping as a means of calling the attention of her consort, the ever-ascetic, ever-meditative Lord Shiva. Various tales depict her desperately attempting to pull him away from his reclusive states, and in this way, she is quite reminiscent of the iconography of the deer, which is an animal that Lord Shiva himself restricts as it is associated with the concept of distraction. So goddess Parvati and the icon of the deer are connected in this way, as both are forces that assault the calm and serene mind of the ascetic to pull him away and into them. There is a drama to goddess Parvati. Her theatricality, her exaggerations, her hysteria contrast completely the deep calm and peacefulness of Lord Shiva. Goddess Parvati feels pressured to behave this way in order to excite, rile, and compel Lord Shiva towards her. So even the tales of Goddess Parvati carry with them these very frantic energies of anxiety, of the Mrigashira temperament, contrasting with the very serene temperament of Lord Shiva. We are seeing now a certain duality with Mrigashira. On the one hand, when the Mrigashira native is in the presence of a very assertive individual who asserts their energy too strongly on them, they may either run away or combat it. But on the other hand, when they're in the presence of too calm and serene of an individual, they then become the pursuer, assuming more aggressive and more masculine tendencies. And so arriving at a point of ease and arriving at a point of saneness can be difficult. In a relationship, there is always one who is calmer and more passive, and another that is more aggressive and pursuant, which indeed is true of all relationships, but seems to be especially the case in the themes of Mrigashira. But generally, it seems that the best way to catch and trap the deer of Mrigashira is to take the Shaivic approach of acting more calm but concentrated, which are qualities that attract Mrigashira natives. On the subject of Shiva and Parvati, we may even introduce the symbolism of Mrigashira as the nakshatra of temptation, which leads to the chase, as Parvati's role oftentimes is to serve as a temptress, a distraction for Shiva, to call him away from the depths of his penance, so that instead of concentrating on his ascetic activities, he instead focuses all his concentrated power upon her, Parvati. Before we move on to the personality of Mrigashira natives, please consider supporting my channel by subscribing to my Patreon, patreon.com/thehiddenoctave, where I have even posted all of the 9 planets to the nakshatra of Mrigashira, as well as other astrological posts. Consider also purchasing my book as well, Sex and the Stars. One reason a Mrigashira can be accused of being a tease is owing to their anxiety. They will cautiously communicate interest and then suddenly ignore their object of affection, and do this repeatedly, confusing the other person and also provoking some insanity in him, as he is left to question whether or not the Mrigashira native even likes him or not. Mrigashira natives are some of the most guilty of ghosting people, even the very same individuals that they sincerely like, or better yet, especially the individuals that they like. Again, they may ghost from a place of anxiety and paranoia, but also owing to the significations of wishing to protect its own juiciness. Mrigashira women in particular may generally have an odd relationship with men. On the one hand, they may be mean and aggressive and dismissive and overall avoidant of them as a means of protecting their juiciness from being drunk. But on the other hand, since it is the destiny of Soma to be consumed by Agni, there is also somewhat of a desire in the women to be passive and completely allow themselves to be taken over by the male principle. Mrigashira is fundamentally a very feminine nakshatra, and it does indeed wish to be consumed by the fiery principle of a dominant partner, but usually it is when they are more anxious that they adopt more masculine traits as a means of intimidating men because they themselves are fearful somewhat. Mrigashira women can often be quite hard to get as they naturally evade men, and so often only the most persistent and determined men can actually acquire them. Nakshatras like Mrigashira and Aslesha tend to be the most confusing for men to understand in general, because of how generally frustratingly complex and anxious and paranoid and changeable the energy can be. Mrigashira, Ashwini, and Aslesha are the only nakshatras that are directly related to an animal, and so they are particularly instinctual, and oftentimes may exhibit behaviors that may not make a logical sense even to themselves, but can only be understood emotionally or instinctually. Mrigashira and Aslesha most especially epitomize classic frustrating and confusing feminine behavior patterns. For instance, indirect behavior patterns like pulling away from the lover as though she is no longer interested, but doing this precisely because she wants to observe whether or not he will chase her. She could pretend to be upset or exaggerate her emotions to observe whether or not he will tend to her feelings and observe his willingness to pamper her. She may behave in an indecisive manner around her partner, but subconsciously desire him to take charge. The men may be very vain and invest a lot in their appearance. They may care very much about aesthetics and nutrition as well. But one of the reasons the men care so much about being attractive is because they themselves sometimes wish to be pursued. Given the general anxiety of this nakshatra, there may be a fear on the part of the natives, even the male natives, when we speak of romantic pursuits. And so the men may invest a lot in their appearance to inspire others to pursue them instead of being the ones pursuing. It is also one of the reasons why many of the male Mrigashira natives may end up in relationships with older women, since older women tend to possess the confidence to pursue men, and older women don't mind playing the dominant role to a more passive, attractive male. The men of Mrigashira may suffer from some degree of inner passivity and may enjoy the experience of being pursued, so much so that they may even secretly enjoy being pursued by other men, even if they themselves are heterosexual and are not interested in other men. Still, the experience of being chased may excite them. The men of Mrigashira may to some extent enjoy being babied and pampered in relationships, as they can suffer from some neurotic tendencies and so may enjoy a calmer, more emotionally stable partner to serve as their rock. And for this reason, they may enjoy relationships with older women. Both the men and women can be quite vain, being very concerned with what they eat, how they dress, going to the gym, but even then, they may still enjoy indulging in drugs and alcohol, as these are still forms of pleasure they struggle resisting. In general, pursuing Mrigashira natives can be very frustrating, for they can be very evasive for various reasons, which is oftentimes why only the most steady, most dominant, most consistent, most concentrated, and most masculine partners ever manage to get into relationships with them, as they can stay the course. Mrigashira men tend to be more neurotic than the average man, and for other such reasons, they can struggle with not feeling very masculine. And so the Mrigashira path for many of them provokes some level of insecurity in their own masculinity, as they seek to develop ever greater levels of inner calm, inner stability, and overall masculinity in order to combat their otherwise nervous impairments. They can be quite concerned with masculine performance and assuming the male polarity. Mrigashira men can be more sensitive, more emotionally volatile than other types of men, and for this reason may wish to develop techniques of becoming more grounded and stable. It is owing to this dear symbolism that makes Mrigashira either one of the most, or really the most neurotic nakshatra of them all. One generally finds with neurotic placements, like for instance the planet Rahu, is that individuals often find dangerous and unhealthy ways of arriving at states of calm. For instance, individuals that abuse drugs and alcohol are often those who suffer from the most anxiety because they look to such substances to pacify their anxiety. And likewise, what we find with many Mrigashira natives is that they may run to such substances to bring themselves into a state of inner peace, even if these substances cause harm. But fortunately, for the average Mrigashira native, owing to its deity Soma, which is the god that relates to health and nourishment, Mrigashira natives often tend to find healthier ways of calming themselves down from their states of anxiety. Owing to its relationship to goddess Parvati, the natives of this asterism can come across as quite dramatic and even bratty, many would say. They can demand a lot of attention from the people around them, and can even act rather self-centered, with how much they pull other people's attention towards themselves so that their own emotional needs can be tended to. This is one of the reasons why both the men and women often need a partner that is on the more serene and emotionally generous side, sometimes even being a little bit more maternal or paternal. Because if two people in a relationship are very emotionally demanding and constantly need to have their own agitated feelings pacified, it becomes harder for the dynamic to work. The Mrigashira native desires to be babied and may often stick to partners that pamper them the most. But another relationship dynamic is the following. One of the unfortunate dynamics for Mrigashira is to be in a state where there is always one partner that is pulling away from the relationship, but the other is more invested. So it could be a situation where the man is more indifferent to the relationship and more distant and avoidant, and so the woman is always desperately calling for his attention. Or it could be the opposite, where the man is constantly chasing after a woman that is always at a distance even within the relationship. Mrigashira natives often find themselves playing the stereotypical role of goddess Parvati, but in a negative sense, which is desperately trying to pursue a partner who may seem uninterested in them. In the worst cases, we see this even in infidelity, where even when the man shows signs of lacking integrity, self-control, or interest in the relationship, the Mrigashira native may still frantically try to pull the partner back to them and in a sort of desperate fashion. When Mrigashira is operating correctly in a chart, the individual will be very inquisitive and will be quick to connect dots between things. They are very good at playing guessing games as they subconsciously pick up on many things unsaid, which can even make them natural detectives, as with very few clues, they can map out an entire narrative. Mrigashira natives tend to be very good at pattern recognition, as again, owing to their nervousness and general neuroticism, they are hyper alerts and ever vigilant to every stimuli. The women tend to be highly intuitive, and the men make great use of inductive reasoning skills. But because Mrigashira natives often come to conclusions based on their guts, and because their minds are often quite susceptible to suggestion, they can be easily gaslit and made to feel like the things that they are noticing aren't actually there, and the conclusions that they draw come from a place of paranoia. It doesn't help that they can be quite frantic. The natives of Mrigashira love to generate hypotheses and often come to conclusions on matters without concrete proof. Again, they epitomize inductive reasoning abilities. They tend to love puzzles and other guessing games. Owing to the irritability of Mrigashira natives, they can often be quite violent, whether physically or verbally, to the extent of saying things that others may find offensive, but they themselves are also quite sensitive to retaliations. Of course, violence is yet another expression of neuroticism, as even psychologists classify anger under its general umbrella. Relating to the symbolism of temptation, Mrigashira men often feel deeply victimized by the various temptations of the modern world, as they may struggle to control themselves. Individuals who are very neurotic are especially sensitive to addictions like drugs, alcohol, and pornography, because they look to such things to pacify their anxieties and calm them down. And unfortunately, we do sometimes see addictive tendencies in Mrigashira individuals, as they may struggle to still themselves, and so often they may blame external things like our overly sexualized culture for their own lack of control. Recall that Mrigashira is very concerned with preserving its own internal Soma, but owing to its nervousness and neurotic nature, it often ends up spilling its own Soma because it struggles to calm itself down. Though Mrigashira ranks as one of the most neurotic nakshatras, in future videos, we will also speak of another nakshatra that is also deeply neurotic and actually struggles even more with addictions, and that is Shatabisha nakshatra. And we will discuss the different behavior patterns that Shatabisha's neuroticism assumes.